The sound of paper tearing echoed through my son's living room like a thunderclap. My daughter-in-law Melissa stood there, perfectly manicured fingers gripping the fragments of my wedding photo, the last one where Richard and I were together before cancer took him. Her eyes locked with mine, lips curled into a smirk as she dropped the pieces onto the hardwood floor. "You won't be needing these anymore, Eleanor. This house belongs to Jason and me now." She actually laughed then, right in my face, as my 67-year-old hands trembled. I couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. 46 years of marriage in that frame, now scattered at my feet like worthless confetti. My own son just stood there, silent as a statue, not even looking at me. What I didn't tell them that day, what I couldn't say through my tears, was that I had already visited Richard's lawyer the previous afternoon. The real will, the one Richard and I had prepared together during his final days, was safely locked away where neither of them could touch it. I still remember how my hands shook as I gathered those torn pieces from the floor. The beautiful silver frame, a 25th anniversary gift from Richard, now had a crack running through the glass, jagged like the pain in my chest. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but all I could manage was to carefully collect each fragment, feeling Melissa's eyes burning into my back. "Don't bother cleaning up," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "The cleaning service starts tomorrow. We're redecorating everything anyway." I looked up at my son Jason, silently pleading with him to say something, anything. His eyes flickered to mine for just a moment before darting away. In that brief second, I saw something I never thought I'd see in my own child's eyes, shame mixed with greed. It was then I knew with absolute certainty that the son I raised was gone, replaced by a stranger who had chosen money over his own mother. I want you to understand that I never thought my life would come to this. At my age, you expect certain things: the comfort of family, the security of the home you've built, the respect you've earned after decades of putting others first. You never imagine that your twilight years will be spent fighting your own flesh and blood for your dignity. But that's exactly where I found myself at 67, suddenly treated like an unwelcome guest in the home I had shared with Richard for over 4 decades. A home where we had raised our son, celebrated countless Christmases, weathered storms both literal and figurative. The same home where Richard had taken his last breath just 3 months earlier, his hand in mine as he made me promise to take care of our boy. If only he could see what that boy had become. You know, Richard and I were high school sweethearts. We met in 1972 during senior year. He was the quiet, thoughtful boy who tutored me in algebra, and I was the chatty cheerleader who couldn't understand why letters belonged in math. Our first date was at Millie's Diner on the edge of town in Burlington, Vermont, a place that still exists, though it's called something else now. I ordered a chocolate malt and spilled it all over his new shirt. Instead of getting upset, he laughed and said, "Well, I guess you've left your mark on me already." Little did we know how true those words would be. We married young, just 20 years old, in a small ceremony at my parents' backyard. No fancy venue, no expensive dress. Just 2 kids crazy about each other, with $50 in savings and dreams as vast as the Vermont sky. We moved to Massachusetts after college, both of us landing teaching jobs, Richard in high school science, me in elementary education. We saved every penny, working summer jobs, taking on tutoring, anything to build our future. It took 7 years of sacrifice, but in 1979, we put a down payment on that house on Maple Street. $42,500. It cost a fortune to us then. I can still smell the fresh paint as we walked through the empty rooms, planning where everything would go. "This is our forever home," Richard had whispered, holding me close in what would become our living room. "We'll grow old here together, Eleanor." We were so young then, barely 27, with no idea of the journey ahead. Jason came along 2 years later, our miracle baby, after the doctor had told us children might not be possible. The day he was born was the only time I ever saw Richard cry, standing there in the hospital room, this tiny bundle in his arms, tears streaming down his face as he promised our son the world. Richard worked his way up to principal over the years, and I eventually became head of the elementary school English department. We weren't wealthy by any means, but we were comfortable. We put money away each month for Jason's college fund, for retirement, for the just-in-case moments life inevitably throws your way. Richard was meticulous about our finances. Every Sunday night, He'd sit at the kitchen table with his ledger, making sure every dollar was accounted for. "We need to be smart, Ellie," he'd say. "No one else will look after our future." I used to tease him about being so careful, but now I thank God for his foresight. If Richard hadn't been so diligent, so forward-thinking, I don't know where I'd be today. Probably on the street. If Melissa had her way. Jason was always a good boy. Sensitive, intelligent, perhaps a bit too eager to please. He excelled in school, made the honor roll every semester, captained the debate team. We were so proud of him when he got accepted to Boston University on a partial scholarship in 1999. His father and I made up the difference, of course. $15,000 a year we contributed. Money we'd set aside specifically for his education. He studied business administration, and we supported every ambition he had. When he wanted to spend a semester abroad in London, we found the extra $8,000, even though it meant postponing the kitchen renovation we'd been saving for. His future comes first, Richard had insisted, and I agreed without hesitation. What parent wouldn't sacrifice for their child? What parent wouldn't give everything to see their child succeed? But sometimes I wonder now, did we give too much? Did we make it too easy for him to take, and take, and take, without understanding the cost? It was during his final year of college that Jason met Melissa. She was studying marketing, with dreams of working for a big advertising agency. I remember the first time he brought her home for Thanksgiving in 2002. She was beautiful, no denying that, tall and slender, with perfectly highlighted hair and clothes that looked straight out of a magazine. She brought an expensive bottle of wine and complimented everything from my cooking to my home decor. Yet something felt rehearsed. There was a calculation behind her smile, a sharpness in her eyes when she thought no one was looking. Richard sensed it too. "She's got ambition, that one," he murmured later that night as we were getting ready for bed. "Let's just hope she sees Jason for who he is, not what he might give her." I dismissed his concerns then. "You're just being an overprotective father," I told him, patting his cheek affectionately. "No one will ever be good enough for your son." How I wish I'd paid more attention to his instincts. They dated for 3 years before getting engaged. During that time, Melissa transformed from the polite, somewhat reserved young woman we'd first met into someone increasingly comfortable in our home, our lives. She had opinions about everything, how we should renovate the house, where we should invest our savings, even suggesting Richard consider early retirement so they could help us manage things. I noticed how Jason began to echo her thoughts, almost word for word sometimes. The son who once called me every Sunday without fail now seemed to check in only when Melissa prompted him to, his words sounding like lines from a script she'd prepared. The wedding was lavish, far beyond what we'd budgeted for. When I gently suggested scaling back, Melissa looked at me with such disdain. "This is our special day, Eleanor," she said, emphasizing my name like it was something distasteful. "Don't you want your only son to have the best?" She made me feel small, selfish, as if wanting to stay within our means somehow meant I didn't love my son enough. In the end, Richard and I contributed $35,000, nearly our entire savings for that year. After the wedding, things changed even more rapidly. Jason and Melissa moved to Chicago for her job at a prestigious marketing firm. Our calls became less and less frequent. Their visits home rare and always rushed. When they did come, Melissa would spend hours on her phone, sighing dramatically at our slow internet connection, making comments about how quaint and outdated our home was. I tried so hard to connect with her, to build a relationship. I learned her favorite foods, remembered details about her work projects, always asked about her parents in Connecticut, but nothing seemed to bridge the gap. To her, I was just the old-fashioned mother-in-law, an obstacle rather than family. Then, in 2019, everything changed again. Richard was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, stage 4, terminal. The doctors gave him 6 months to a year. He fought for exactly 11 months and 13 days. Those final months were both beautiful and terrible. Beautiful because Richard and I treasured every moment, every conversation, every touch like never before. Terrible because watching the love of your life slowly slip away is a kind of torture I wouldn't wish on anyone. Jason came home when we first got the diagnosis, stayed for a week, then returned to Chicago. He called regularly at first, but as the months went on, the calls became less frequent. "He's busy with work," Richard would say, making excuses. I knew he didn't believe. It's hard for him to see me like this, but a parent knows their child, and I knew there was more to it. I finally understood what was happening when I overheard a phone conversation between Jason and Melissa 3 months into Richard's illness. I hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but as I approached the guest bedroom with fresh towels, I heard my son's voice, low and tense. Yes, I know, Mel. Dad's updating his will tomorrow. No, I don't know the details yet. Yes, of course I care about the house, but I can't just ask him right now. My heart dropped to my stomach. While we were counting Richard's remaining days, they were counting his assets. I never told Richard what I heard. He had enough burdens without adding the weight of our son's betrayal. Instead, I began paying closer attention, noticing how Jason would bring up financial matters when he thought Richard was having a good day. Have you thought about what Mom will do with the house after? Or do you think it makes sense for Mom to manage the investments alone? Little comments, subtle suggestions. And every time he visited, Melissa would find ways to mention how perfect the house would be for them, how they'd been thinking of moving back east, how they could take care of me if I found the house too much to handle on my own. I played dumb, nodded along, all while my stomach twisted into knots. Richard noticed too, though we spoke of it only once. It was late, one of those nights. When pain kept him awake, he reached for my hand in the darkness and whispered, "Promise me you'll protect yourself, Ellie, even from Jason if you have to." I squeezed his hand, tears streaming down my face, and made that promise. 2 weeks before Richard passed, he asked me to call his lawyer, Michael Abernathy. Michael had been our friend for over 30 years, had helped us with everything from our wills to Jason's college trust fund. He came to the house the next day. Richard asked me to give them privacy. So I went to tend my garden. The roses Richard had planted for our 40th anniversary were just beginning to bloom. They spoke for over 2 hours. When Michael left, he hugged me tightly and said, "Don't worry, Eleanor. Everything will be taken care of." Richard seemed more peaceful after that, as if a burden had been lifted. When I asked what they'd discussed, he simply said, "Insurance for our promises to each other." I didn't press him further. Some vows don't need words to be understood. A week before we lost him, Richard had one last, truly lucid day, a gift I'll forever cherish. We sat in the sunroom, his hand in mine, watching birds at the feeder he'd built years ago. "When I'm gone," he said suddenly, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks, "Jason and Melissa will show you who they really are. Remember who you are, Eleanor. Remember what we built together. Don't let anyone take that from you." I promised him I wouldn't. 3 days later, he slipped into a coma. 4 days after that, with me holding his hand and whispering our favorite memories into his ear, Richard let go. The funeral was on a Tuesday. It rained, a soft, gentle summer rain that seemed to mirror the quiet grief consuming me. Jason and Melissa arrived the night before and stayed at a hotel despite my offer to prepare the guest room. "It's easier this way," Jason had said, not quite meeting my eyes. The service was beautiful, attended by hundreds of Richard's former students, colleagues, and friends. So many people came up to tell me how he'd changed their lives: the struggling student he'd stayed late to tutor, the teacher he'd mentored, the neighbor whose medical bills he'd quietly helped with when times were tough. Each story was a testament to the man I'd loved for nearly 5 decades, each memory a balm to my broken heart. Jason gave a eulogy that sounded rehearsed, peppered with anecdotes that seemed designed to emphasize his role as the devoted son. Melissa stood beside him, appropriate tears glistening but never quite falling, her black designer dress more suited for a gala than a funeral. The real shock came the next morning. I was still in my robe, nursing a cup of tea at the kitchen table, surrounded by sympathy cards I couldn't bring myself to open, when they arrived. No call, no warning, just the sound of a key in the lock, the spare we'd given Jason for emergencies, and suddenly they were standing in my kitchen. "Mom," Jason said, his voice oddly formal, "we need to discuss arrangements." Arrangements, such a cold, sterile word. Before I could ask what he meant, Melissa jumped in. "We've been talking, Eleanor, and we think it makes the most sense for you to start looking at retirement communities. This house is far too big for just one person, and the maintenance alone." She trailed off, her eyes already measuring the space, reimagining it without me in it. I sat there, stunned, the grief of losing Richard still raw, now, compounded by the realization that I might lose my home too. "The will reading is next week," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Shouldn't we wait to discuss this until after we know Richard's wishes? Jason shifted uncomfortably, but Melissa's smile never wavered. Oh, we already know the outline, she said smoothly. Jason's father would want him to have the family home. I'm sure of it. The certainty in her voice sent a chill through me. What had they done? That week was one of the darkest of my life. Jason and Melissa didn't return to Chicago, instead taking up residence at their hotel, while making daily visits to my home, never asking if it was convenient, never calling ahead. Each time they arrived, they had some new helpful suggestion. Perhaps I should start packing up Richard's clothes. They knew a great estate sale organizer who could help me downsize. They'd already researched several lovely retirement villages within a reasonable distance, though. Their definition of reasonable seemed to be at least an hour away from the community I'd been part of for 40 years. Each suggestion felt like a knife twist, each conversation pushing me further toward the edge I was already teetering on. I began to dread the sound of their car in the driveway, the click of Melissa's heels on my hardwood floors. I started keeping the doors locked, pretending not to be home when they knocked. I couldn't face them, couldn't bear to watch them circling like vultures, waiting for me to surrender what Richard and I had built together. The night before the will reading, I couldn't sleep. I paced the house in my slippers, touching the walls, the furniture, all the little things that made this house our home. The chip in the kitchen counter from when Jason had dropped Richard's hammer while helping with repairs as a 10-year-old, the height marks penciled on the doorframe in the study, tracking our son's growth from a tiny boy to the man who now seemed determined to push me out of my own life. The slight dip in Richard's side of our mattress, which I couldn't bring myself to replace because it still held his shape. This wasn't just a house. It was the physical embodiment of our love story, our struggles, our triumphs. Every mortgage payment, every leaky faucet we'd fixed together, every wall we'd painted and repainted as our tastes changed over the decades, all of it represented our partnership, our shared life. How could I possibly walk away from that? Yet with each passing hour, I became more convinced that's exactly what Jason and Melissa expected me to do. Little did they know, Richard had seen this coming. Little did they know, he had prepared me for this betrayal in ways they couldn't possibly imagine. The will reading was scheduled for 10 a.m. at Michael Abernathy's office downtown. I arrived early, my hands trembling so badly I could barely sign in with the receptionist. I'd worn Richard's favorite dress, a simple blue sheath he'd given me for our 45th anniversary. It matches your eyes, he'd said when I opened it. I'd also brought a small photograph of us, tucked into my purse where I could touch it for courage. The conference room was intimidatingly formal, all dark wood and leather chairs, with Michael's diplomas and certifications lining the walls. I sat alone for several minutes, breathing in the scent of lemon polish and old books, trying to calm my racing heart. When Jason and Melissa finally arrived, precisely at 10, they seemed surprised to see me already there. "Mom," Jason said with a nod, choosing a seat across the table rather than beside me. Melissa sat next to him, impeccably dressed in a cream-colored pantsuit that probably cost more than my monthly pension. She didn't speak, just offered a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. The distance between us, physical and emotional, felt vast and unbridgeable. Michael entered exactly 2 minutes later, carrying a thick folder. He'd been at the funeral but looked even more somber now in his charcoal suit. He'd known Richard since college, had been there for every major milestone in our lives. The gravity in his expression told me he understood exactly what was at stake today. "Thank you all for coming," he began formally. "We're here to discuss the last will and testament of Richard James Wilson." He placed his reading glasses on his nose and opened the folder. "Before I begin, I want to clarify that this is the most recently updated version, signed and notarized 3 weeks before Richard's passing, with myself and 2 other attorneys as witnesses. This will revokes and supersedes all previous versions." At this, I saw Jason and Melissa exchange a quick glance. A tiny furrow appeared between Melissa's perfectly shaped eyebrows, the first crack in her confident facade. Michael continued, his voice steady and clear. "I'll summarize the key points first, then we can go through any questions you might have." He paused, looking directly at me with compassion in his eyes. "Eleanor, Richard wanted me to tell you personally how much he loved you. He said you were the best decision he ever made." The tears came then, hot and unstoppable. I fumbled in my purse for a tissue, my fingers brushing against the photo I'd brought. Michael waited patiently for me to compose myself before continuing. To Jason Daniel Wilson, Richard leaves the sum of $25,000 to be paid in a single disbursement. He paused, allowing the words to sink in. Jason's face remained carefully neutral, but his knuckles whitened as his hands clenched into fists beneath the table. Melissa's reaction was less controlled. Her mouth actually dropped open for a moment before she caught herself. "That's it?" she blurted out, then immediately tried to recover. "I mean, surely there must be more." "The house?" Michael held up a hand, silencing her mid-sentence. "I'm getting to that," he said, his tone professional but cold. He turned a page in the document. To Eleanor Margaret Wilson, Richard leaves all remaining financial assets, including but not limited to bank accounts, investment portfolios, retirement funds, insurance policies, and personal possessions. This amounts to approximately $857,000 in total assets. I heard Melissa's sharp intake of breath, saw Jason's jaw clench and unclench. But Michael wasn't finished. Regarding the property at 47 Maple Street, Michael continued, Richard has established the following conditions. He looked directly at Jason and Melissa now. The house and land remain the sole property of Eleanor Wilson for as long as she chooses to reside there. Upon her death, or should she voluntarily choose to sell the property, 50% of the proceeds will go to a trust established for educational scholarships in Richard and Eleanor's names at Burlington High School. The remaining 50% will be divided equally between Jason Wilson and 3 charities selected by Richard and Eleanor. Specifically, the American Cancer Society, the local Veterans Support Center, and the Public Library Building Fund. The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear the ticking of the wall clock, the faint hum of the air conditioning, even my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Jason looked stunned, as if he'd been physically struck. Melissa's face had drained of all color, leaving her makeup garish against her suddenly pale skin. I sat very still, Richard's words echoing in my mind. Remember who you are, Eleanor. Remember what we built together. Don't let anyone take that from you. Michael cleared his throat, breaking the tension. There is also a letter, he said, pulling out an envelope sealed with wax, Richard's old-fashioned touch. Richard asked that I read this aloud in the presence of all parties. He broke the seal carefully and unfolded a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was unmistakably Richard's, slightly shaky from illness, but still the same precise script I'd watched flow from his pen for nearly 50 years. To my family, Michael began reading, If you're hearing this, then I've moved on to whatever comes next. Eleanor, my love, my partner, my heart, thank you for every moment of joy, for your strength during my illness, for being the person I could always count on. You deserve every happiness, every comfort, every day of peace. The decisions I've made in this will reflect what I believe to be right and just, based on what I've observed in my final months. Michael paused, adjusting his glasses before continuing. Jason, you have chosen your path. I've watched you change from the thoughtful boy we raised into someone I barely recognize, someone who, even as I was dying, seemed more concerned with what he would inherit than with the limited time we had left. This will reflect my response to those choices. The letter continued, Richard's words laying bare the disappointment he'd felt, the betrayal he'd witnessed. A parent's love is unconditional, Michael read, but respect must be earned. The modest inheritance I've left you reflects not a lack of love, but a recognition of the values you've demonstrated. Should you ever rediscover the person you were raised to be, the son who understood that family means more than property, that integrity matters more than wealth, perhaps you and your mother can rebuild what's been broken. That decision, like the decision about the house, I leave in Eleanor's capable hands. Michael folded the letter carefully when he finished. No one spoke. Jason's face had crumpled, a war of emotions playing across features so like his father's. Shame, anger, denial, all fighting for dominance. Melissa was the first to recover, her shock quickly hardening into something ugly and cold. This can't be legal, she snapped, leaning forward aggressively. Jason is his only child. There must be an earlier will, one before Richard was influenced. Her eyes flicked to me, the accusation clear. Michael's response was immediate and firm. I assure you, this will is entirely legal and properly executed. Richard was of sound mind. evaluated by 2 independent physicians prior to signing. If you wish to contest it, that is your right, but I would advise against it. The documentation is extensive. Jason finally found his voice, though it cracked when he spoke. Dad really wrote that letter. Those were his words. Michael nodded solemnly. Word for word, Jason. Provide a handwriting analysis, if necessary. Jason shook his head, his expression unreadable. Melissa, however, was not finished. She turned to me, her perfect veneer cracking completely, revealing the person she truly was. You did this, she hissed. You turned him against us. You manipulated a dying man to get what you wanted. The accusation was so absurd, so contrary to the reality I'd lived, that I actually laughed, a short, pained sound that surprised even me. What I wanted, I said, finding my voice at last, was for my husband not to die. What I wanted was for my son to be there for his father without calculating what he might gain from it. What I wanted was the family I thought I had. I stood up, my legs steadier than I expected. Richard made his own decisions, based on what he saw with his own eyes. If you're unhappy with those decisions, perhaps you should examine your actions rather than blame me. For a moment, I thought Melissa might lunge across the table at me. Her face contorted with rage, all pretense of civility abandoned. This isn't over, she snarled, gathering her designer purse and standing abruptly. We'll fight this. You can't just cut us out. Michael intervened smoothly, his tone professional but with an edge of steel. Mrs. Wilson, Melissa, I strongly advise against making threats. Contesting this will would be costly, time-consuming, and based on my professional assessment, ultimately unsuccessful. Furthermore, it would require bringing evidence of your behavior during Richard's illness into public record. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny? The question hung in the air, pointed and deliberate. Something shifted in Melissa's expression, calculation replacing pure rage as she assessed the situation. Without another word, she turned and stormed out, her heels clicking aggressively against the hardwood floor. Jason remained seated, looking lost and suddenly very young. Mom, he began, but seemed unable to find the words to continue. I think, Michael said gently, that you two might need some time alone. He gathered his papers and tactfully exited, closing the door behind him with a soft click. For several long minutes, Jason and I sat in silence, the gulf between us seeming both vast and paradoxically smaller than it had been in years. He was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know he knew about the conversations with Melissa, about everything. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw not just the man who had disappointed me, but the boy I had raised, somewhere beneath the surface. Your father always saw more than people gave him credit for, I said simply, especially when it came to those he loved. Jason nodded, swallowing hard. I don't know what to say. I can't defend. He trailed off, running his hands through his hair, a gesture so like Richard's, it made my heart ache. When did I become this person? The question seemed directed more at himself than at me, but I answered anyway. I don't know, Jason, but I do know that your father believed you could find your way back. And despite everything, I believe that too. That conversation in Michael's office marked the beginning of a long, difficult journey, not just for Jason and me, but for our entire fractured family. We didn't resolve everything that day, or even in the weeks that followed. Some wounds cut too deep for quick healing, but it was a starting point, a moment of truth that stripped away pretenses and forced us to see ourselves and each other clearly. Jason returned to Chicago alone the next day. Melissa had apparently taken an earlier flight, unable or unwilling to face the consequences of what had happened. He called me a week later, his voice hesitant but determined. I've been thinking about what Dad wrote, he said, about rediscovering who I was raised to be. I want to try, Mom. I don't know if I can fix everything I've broken, but I want to try. It was the first honest conversation we'd had in years, painful but necessary. I told him I needed time, that trust once shattered doesn't mend overnight. He accepted that with a humility I hadn't seen in him since before Melissa entered our lives. It was a small step, but a step nonetheless. The aftermath of the will reading brought other challenges. True to her word, Melissa didn't let things rest easily. 3 weeks later, I received formal notification that she and Jason were contesting the will, claiming I had exerted undue influence over Richard during his illness. The irony would have been laughable if it hadn't been so painful. Michael reassured me that their case had no legal merit, but warned me the process would be stressful and potentially lengthy. "They're hoping you'll settle just to avoid the hassle," he explained during one of our many meetings. "It's a common tactic, especially against elderly individuals." His use of elderly to describe me stung slightly, but I understood his point. They were counting on me being too tired, too grief-stricken, too intimidated to fight. They had drastically underestimated the woman Richard Wilson had chosen to spend his life with. The legal battle dragged on for months, draining not just financially but emotionally. Jason withdrew from the case after our conversation, but Melissa pressed forward alone, hiring an aggressive attorney who specialized in contesting wills. Every week seemed to bring some new filing, some new accusation, some new attempt to force me into submission. I found myself digging through years of financial records, medical reports, even our personal correspondence to defend against her claims. It was exhausting, invasive, like having my entire life with Richard laid out and dissected by strangers. There were days I considered giving up, days when the fight seemed too much to bear on top of my grief. But then I would remember Richard's words. "Remember who you are, Eleanor," and find the strength to continue. What kept me going, more than anything, was knowing I was fighting not just for myself, but for the truth of our life together, for the values we had lived by. It was during this difficult period that unexpected allies emerged. My neighbor Margaret, a retired legal secretary, began helping me organize the mountains of paperwork the case generated. "Richard always shoveled my walk in winter," she said simply when I tried to thank her. "This is what neighbors do." Former colleagues from both our teaching days appeared at my door with casseroles and company, sitting with me through long evenings when loneliness threatened to overwhelm me. Former students of Richard's, now adults with families of their own, wrote letters testifying to his character, his soundness of mind, his integrity. Even Jason, in his own way, became an ally. He called regularly, not pushing for reconciliation but simply checking in, listening when I needed to talk, respecting my boundaries when I needed space. He sent me a letter formally withdrawing from Melissa's legal challenge, stating unequivocally that he believed his father's will represented his true wishes. That letter became a key piece of evidence in our favor, undermining Melissa's entire case. 6 months after the will reading, we finally had our day in court. I was terrified, having never testified in any legal proceeding before. Michael had prepared me as best he could, but nothing could fully ready me for sitting in that witness box, swearing to tell the truth about the most intimate details of my life and marriage. Melissa sat at the plaintiff's table, immaculate as always, her expression a carefully constructed mask of grief and concern. The story her lawyer tried to tell was one of manipulation and opportunism, portraying me as a greedy widow who had taken advantage of my dying husband's weakened state to secure my financial future at the expense of his only son. Reality they deliberately ignored was that Richard and I had built our life and our modest wealth together, dollar by dollar, sacrifice by sacrifice, over nearly 5 decades of partnership. When it was my turn to testify, Michael started with a simple question. "Mrs. Wilson, can you tell the court about your financial contributions to the household during your marriage to Richard?" It was a strategic opening, designed to establish facts rather than emotions. I took a deep breath and began recounting our shared financial history, my teaching salary that had sometimes exceeded Richard's in the early years, the summers I'd worked at the community college to help pay for home repairs, the inheritance from my parents that had funded our kitchen renovation. I spoke of the joint decisions, the shared sacrifices, the careful planning we'd done together. I explained how we'd helped Jason through college, the extra jobs we'd taken to ensure he graduated debt-free, the down payment we'd contributed to his first condo in Chicago. With each detail, each date, each dollar amount, the picture became clearer. This was not Richard's wealth alone, but our shared life's work. The judge, a stern-faced woman in her 60s, listened attentively, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When Melissa's attorney cross-examined me, trying to trip me up on dates or amounts, I remained calm, referring to the meticulous records Richard and I had kept throughout our marriage. "And these financial decisions?" the lawyer asked, his tone deliberately condescending. "You expect the court to believe these were equally made, that a high school science teacher and eventual principal consulted his elementary school teacher wife on all financial matters?" The dismissiveness in his voice sparked something in me, not anger, but a quiet, firm resolve. Our marriage was a partnership, I replied, looking directly at the judge rather than the attorney. Richard and I made all major decisions together, financial, personal, everything. That was the foundation of our relationship for 46 years. If you find that unusual, perhaps that says more about your view of marriage than it does about ours. The case concluded more quickly than anyone expected. After 3 days of testimony, including powerful statements from Michael about Richard's mental clarity when updating his will, and from the physicians who had assessed him, the judge ruled decisively in our favor. The court finds no evidence of undue influence, she stated, her voice firm and clear. The will of Richard James Wilson stands as written, representing his clear and legally sound intentions. I sat there, overcome with emotion as she continued. Furthermore, the court finds this contest to have been brought without sufficient merit and potentially in bad faith. The plaintiff will therefore be responsible for all legal fees incurred by the defendant in this matter. The sound of Melissa's outraged gasp echoed through the courtroom, but it was quickly drowned out by the gentle squeeze of Margaret's hand on mine and Michael's quiet congratulations. Eleanor, Richard would be proud. Melissa didn't speak to me as she left the courtroom, her back rigid with anger and defeat. I didn't expect her to. Some bridges, once burned, cannot be rebuilt, nor should they be. I felt no triumph in that moment, only relief that Richard's wishes would be honored and a deep, aching sadness for what our family had become. As Michael helped me gather my things, I caught sight of a familiar figure waiting near the courtroom doors. Jason stood awkwardly, hands in his pockets, uncertainty written across his face. When our eyes met, he gave a small, hesitant nod. I nodded back, not yet ready for more, but acknowledging the possibility of something new growing from the ashes of what we'd lost. Later that night, alone in the home Richard and I had shared, I allowed myself to truly cry for the first time. Since the will reading, not just for Richard, but for all of it, the betrayal, the fight, the cost of standing my ground, they weren't entirely tears of sadness though. Mixed in was something else, relief, vindication, and the first fragile tendrils of peace. In the year that followed, I slowly rebuilt my life, not returning to what had been, which was impossible without Richard, but creating something new that honored what we'd shared while acknowledging my changed reality. I joined a grief support group at the community center, where I met others navigating the painful terrain of loss. I returned to volunteering at the elementary school's reading program 3 mornings a week, finding purpose in helping young minds discover the joy of books. I tended Richard's garden, talking to him among the roses as I worked, finding comfort in these one-sided conversations, and gradually, carefully, I began rebuilding my relationship with Jason. It wasn't easy. The trust that had been broken couldn't simply be restored with apologies or good intentions, but we started small, brief phone calls that became longer conversations, occasional visits where we relearned how to be in each other's presence without the shadow of Melissa between us. I learned later that Jason and Melissa had separated shortly after the court case. He didn't share many details, and I didn't press, but he did tell me one thing that stuck with me. She couldn't understand why I wouldn't keep fighting for the house, he said during one of his visits, 6 months after the trial. She kept saying it was my birthright, that you were stealing my inheritance. But all I could think about was Dad's letter, about rediscovering the person I was raised to be. And that person wouldn't have been fighting his mother for a house that was never just about the property or the money. He paused then, swallowing hard before meeting my eyes directly. It was about the home you and Dad built together. I understand that now. It wasn't a complete reconciliation. We had too much history, too many unhealed wounds for that, but it was a beginning, a foundation we could build on, one honest conversation at a time. As for Melissa, I heard through Jason that she'd relocated to California after their divorce was finalized, taking a position with a marketing firm in Los Angeles. She never contacted me again, which was probably best for both of us. Sometimes I wonder if she ever reflected on what happened, if she ever recognized her role in the unraveling of our family. But that's her journey, not mine. My energy is better spent on those who choose to be part of my life now, like Margaret, who still comes over every Wednesday for coffee and conversation. Like my grief group friends, who understand the complexities of moving forward while keeping space for what's been lost. Like Jason, who visits every month now, each time staying a little longer, each conversation digging a little deeper into the healing we both need. 2 years after Richard's passing, I made a decision that surprised even me. Using some of the investment money Richard had left, I established a small scholarship in our names at the high school where we'd both taught, not waiting for my own passing as specified in the will for the larger endowment, but creating something I could see in action during my lifetime. Every spring, I personally present the award to a graduating senior who demonstrates academic promise coupled with financial need. The first year, I found myself standing at the podium, looking out at the sea of young faces. So much hope, so much potential, and I felt Richard's presence beside me so strongly, I almost turned to look for him. Education was the cornerstone of our lives, I told the audience, my voice steady despite the emotions swirling within me. My husband believed that knowledge was the greatest gift we could give to the next generation. This scholarship continues that legacy. As I handed the certificate to the first recipient, a brilliant young woman headed to study environmental science, I saw in her eyes the same determination Richard and I had shared at her age. In that moment, I understood another dimension of Richard's wisdom in crafting his will the way he had. It wasn't just about protecting me, but about ensuring our values outlived us both. Living alone in our home has been an adjustment. There are still nights I reach across the bed, momentarily forgetting Richard won't be there. Days I hear the front door open and expect his voice calling my name, but there's comfort in these walls that know our history. In the garden, where his favorite rosebush still blooms each spring. In the kitchen, where I still sometimes cook for two out of habit, then smile at myself and save the leftovers. I've made changes, repainting the living room, a color Richard always liked but I had resisted, converting his study into a reading nook where I host a monthly book club for fellow retired teachers. The house evolves with me, honoring our past while accommodating my present. I know someday I might decide it's time to downsize, to find a place better suited to aging alone. When that day comes, I'll make that choice on my terms, in my own time, with the knowledge that wherever I go, Richard's love and the life we built together will go with me. Last week, Jason helped me go through some of Richard's old things, a task I'd been postponing for too long. We found a box of photographs in the attic, including one I thought had been lost forever. Our wedding day. Richard and I laughing as we fed each other cake, young and radiant and absolutely certain of our love. Jason held it carefully, studying our faces. "You guys really were the real deal, weren't you?" he said softly. "All those years, all those challenges, and you never stopped choosing each other." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. He handed the photo back to me, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small parcel wrapped in tissue paper. "I found this when I was cleaning out my old storage unit," he said, placing it in my hands. I unwrapped it slowly to find the broken pieces of the silver frame Melissa had destroyed that day. The day everything changed. Jason had carefully gathered every fragment. "I kept meaning to get it fixed," he said, looking away, embarrassed. "But maybe we could do that together." The gesture, imperfect and heartfelt, brought tears to my eyes. "I'd like that," I said simply. Some broken things can never be made whole again, but others, with care and patience and honest effort, can be restored into something new, different from what they were, bearing the marks of their breaking, but beautiful in their own way. So that's my story, the one I never expected to live at this stage of my life. When I look back at that terrible moment when Melissa tore up our photo, when my world seemed to be collapsing around me, I realized now it was actually the beginning of something important, painful, yes, but necessary. It forced me to stand up for myself in ways I never had before, to discover strengths I didn't know I possessed, to become not just Richard's widow but my own person with my own power. If you're listening to this and facing your own moment of betrayal or loss, please know that the darkness doesn't last forever, that finding your voice, setting boundaries, honoring your worth, these aren't selfish acts but necessary ones, that what feels like an ending might actually be a beginning, if you're brave enough to walk through it. I still miss Richard every day. I still talk to him in the garden, still tell him about my day as I'm falling asleep. But I've learned that loving someone who's gone doesn't mean stopping your own life. It means carrying them with you as you continue your journey, letting their love and wisdom guide you even as you forge your own path forward. There's one thing this whole experience taught me. It's that we are stronger than we know, until being strong is the only choice we have. So, if you're facing your own impossible moment, take a breath, remember who you are and what you're worth, and keep going. And if you know someone who's struggling to find their strength, share this story with them. Sometimes, knowing we're not alone in our battles makes all the difference. Whatever you're facing, remember, this too shall pass, and something new awaits on the other side. Thank you for listening, and please leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. If you found value in my story, don't forget to like and subscribe. I'm recording from my reading nook today, surrounded by the books Richard and I collected over our lifetime together, finding comfort in these old friends as I share my journey with you.